Today, we are going to unpack the causes, the major battles, and the truly profound aftermath of the deadliest conflict in human history, the Second World War. Now, I know it's a massive topic, but by breaking it down together, we can really start to understand the incredible forces that literally shaped our modern world.
So, a big question right off the bat. How did we go from the hope of peace after the First World War to an even more devastating global catastrophe just 2 short decades later? Well, let's dive right into this and discover how the unresolved tensions of a previous era essentially ignited a global firestorm.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the seeds of conflict, move on to Axis versus Allies, watch the global war escalate, examine the turning points and tactics, and finally, look at the devastating aftermath. Okay, part 1, the seeds of conflict and the powder keg of the 1930s. You know, the 1930s was practically a perfect storm for disaster. You had the devastating global economic collapse, the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, combining with this intense, lingering resentment from the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. Remember, that treaty harshly punished Germany after World War I, stripping its land and gutting its military. Throw in hyperinflation and mass unemployment, and you've got a population desperate for answers. This desperation totally opened the door for fascist leaders like Adolf Hitler in Germany and Benito Mussolini in Italy. They promised a return to glory, rapid rearmament, and this violent imperialist push for territory, which Hitler called Lebensraum, or living space. Now, as Germany started rapidly building up its military, which, by the way, completely defied the Treaty of Versailles, the Western powers like Britain and France tried a strategy called appeasement. They were desperately hoping to avoid another top-to-bottom European war. The trauma of the First World War was still incredibly fresh, right? So they essentially gave in to some of Hitler's early territorial demands, like taking over Austria and the Sudetenland, just crossing their fingers that every concession would be his loss.
This mindset literally led to British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain coming back from the 1938 Munich Agreement, waving a piece of paper and famously declaring peace for our time. But looking back, this policy of appeasement was a fatal miscalculation. It just emboldened the fascist regimes. It gave them incredibly valuable time to build up their war machines, while basically teaching them that the international community wouldn't step up and fight back.
Which brings us to part 2, Axis versus Allies, as the world divides. This wasn't going to be a localized dispute. This quickly became a war of massive alliances. We're talking 61 countries eventually drawn into the fray. On one side, you've got the Axis powers, primarily anchored by Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Italy. On the flip side, the Allied powers, initially led by the UK and France, but later joined by heavyweights like the Soviet Union, the USA, and China, along with nations from Poland to Australia. It was a true world war.
So, what was the spark? Well, after signing a stunning non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, Hitler knew his eastern border was secure. So, on September 1st, 1939, he invaded Poland. That was it. The fragile peace in Europe was shattered. Realizing that appeasement had completely failed, Britain and France drew a line in the sand and declared war on Germany just 2 days later.
Moving on to part 3, the global war escalates and the fire spreads. At first, there was an 8-month lull that people actually called the phony war. But then, the Germans unleashed something entirely new on Western Europe: Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This wasn't the slow, grueling trench warfare of World War I. This was all about surprise and speed. Using coordinated airstrikes, lightning-fast panzer tanks, and motorized infantry, they completely bypassed traditional defenses. The psychological shock was absolutely immense, leading to the rapid and stunning fall of countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually France.
From there, the conflict violently escalated from a European crisis into a sprawling, two-front global war. We had the fall of France in May 1940. Then, in June 1941, Hitler made a monumental strategic gamble. He broke his pact with the Soviets and launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the USSR. And just a few months later, the war truly spanned the entire globe.
On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. They were driven by an imperialist need for resources and wanted to knock out the American fleet. But actually, it had the exact opposite effect. It instantly forced the isolationist United States directly into the global conflict.
Suddenly, the Axis powers were facing the combined industrial and military might of the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States. A real game changer.
Let's look at part 4, turning points and tactics. The tides shift. Because, with the US in the fight and the Soviet Union waging a brutal war of attrition in the East, the momentum finally started to swing. But it wasn't just won by huge armies clashing on a battlefield. It was about strategic resistance. You had the French resistance under Charles de Gaulle utilizing sabotage. You had the Soviet Union absorbing just catastrophic losses, but somehow halting the German advance. Meanwhile, the Allies completely mobilized their economies for total war, turning out planes and tanks at an unbelievable rate. And let's not forget, this was a massive, diverse effort with crucial participation from Afro-American soldiers who fought incredibly bravely abroad while still facing segregation back home. And finally, part 5, the devastating aftermath, the ashes. Following years of grueling campaigns across Europe and intense island hopping in the Pacific, the Axis forces finally collapsed. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. The Pacific War, however, ground on, ultimately ending only after the unprecedented and truly horrific devastation of 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered in August 1945. The fighting was over, but the reckoning was just starting, marked by the Nuremberg trials that November to prosecute major war criminals.
Now, I need you to pause and really think about this number. An estimated 70 to 85 million people perished. To put that into perspective, that is roughly 3% of the entire global population in 1940. It's a number so massive, so absolutely staggering, that it's almost difficult to wrap your head around the immeasurable grief it represents. And here is the truly heartbreaking part about those statistics. The vast majority of the casualties were civilians. Over 50 million civilian deaths compared to 20 million military. This happened because of total war tactics, aerial bombings leveling entire cities, widespread famine and disease. And horrifically, a massive portion of the civilian death toll was due to the systematic genocide of the Holocaust, where millions of Jews and other marginalized groups were murdered by the Nazi regime. Out of all these ashes, the Allied victors attempted to establish a completely new world order. Through the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, they divided a defeated Germany into 4 occupied zones. They established the United Nations, desperately hoping to prevent a conflict like this from ever happening again. And through those Nuremberg trials, they set a brand new legal precedent for prosecuting leaders for crimes against humanity.
But, as you might guess, the alliance that defeated the Axis didn't exactly last. The political and philosophical divide between the capitalist West and the communist East was just too wide. Almost immediately, the globe split into a Western bloc led by the USA and an Eastern bloc dominated by the Soviet Union. Because really, the conclusion of World War II didn't bring true peace. It just gave birth to the Cold War. We entered a terrifying decades-long era of nuclear deterrence, intense intelligence wars between agencies like the CIA and the KGB, and devastating proxy conflicts all over the globe. The end of the Second World War had basically just reshaped the global battlefield.
Well, thank you for joining me for this explainer. We've covered a massive amount of history today, from the powder keg of the 1930s all the way to the dawn of the Cold War. What do you think?